Outside a luxurious Manhattan apartment building, the cold winter air carried the sound of items being thrown forcefully into a dumpster. Margaret Fleming, the building manager, grabbed what looked like an old backpack and tossed it into the metal container with disgust written across her face. Her designer coat fluttered in the wind as she continued emptying the contents of a shopping cart, muttering about maintaining standards and keeping undesirable elements away from her prestigious property. A few feet away, a man in simple clothes watched silently, his shoulders tense but his expression remarkably composed. His weathered hands clutched a small notebook, the only possession he had managed to keep. The other residents of the building gathered near the entrance, some filming with their phones, others whispering among themselves, but none stepping forward to intervene. What Margaret didn't notice was another figure observing the scene from the shadow of a parked car. Dressed in a worn black hoodie and faded jeans, he went unnoticed by the crowd. His eyes followed every item as it landed in the dumpster: a military medal, a folded American flag, photographs of a family, and what appeared to be valuable research papers. The man's calm demeanor masked a deep understanding of the situation unfolding before him. No one recognized him as Keanu Reeves, and that's exactly how he preferred it. He had come to visit an old friend, only to witness this display of prejudice and hasty judgment. As Margaret reached for the last of the belongings, Keanu stepped forward, knowing that what would happen next would change not just Margaret's perspective, but the entire building's culture of discrimination. The lesson about to unfold would be one that Margaret Fleming would never forget. The prestigious Hamilton Heights apartment building stood tall against the Manhattan skyline, its polished brass entrance gleaming in the morning sun. For Margaret Fleming, managing this exclusive property wasn't just a job. It represented everything she had worked for in her 20-year career. She took pride in maintaining what she called the Hamilton standard, ensuring that every detail, from the marble floors to the crystal chandeliers, reflected absolute perfection. Margaret started each morning with a meticulous inspection of the property. Her Louboutin heels clicked against the marble floors as she examined every corner, her tablet in hand to document any imperfections. The residents knew her as efficient, uncompromising, and sometimes ruthless in her pursuit of excellence. She had earned a reputation for transforming the building into one of the most sought-after addresses in the city. The building's clientele included CEOs, celebrities, and old-money families who valued their privacy and expected flawless service. Margaret took personal pride in knowing each resident's preferences, from the specific temperature they preferred in the lobby to their favorite flowers in the seasonal arrangements. She had mastered the art of anticipating their needs before they voiced them. Today marked her 5th anniversary as the building manager, and she had received a glowing performance review from the board. The chairman had specifically praised her ability to maintain the right environment, a subtle reference to her skill at keeping undesirable elements away from the property. Margaret saw this as validation of her methods, including her strict screening of visitors and her zero-tolerance policy for loitering. However, over the past few weeks, something had been bothering her. She had noticed a man who seemed out of place in their refined environment. He would sit quietly in the small park adjacent to the building, his belongings neatly arranged in a shopping cart. Despite his careful efforts to remain inconspicuous, his presence felt like a blemish on her perfectly maintained world. The man's appearance troubled her. His clothes, though clean, were worn, and his quiet demeanor seemed suspicious to her. She had noticed some residents actually speaking with him, even bringing him coffee occasionally. This growing familiarity felt dangerous to Margaret. She had worked too hard to let someone compromise the building's reputation. What particularly irritated her was the way he had begun storing his cart in a discreet corner of the building's exterior, tucked away where it was barely visible. Though technically on public property, it was too close to her domain for comfort. She had received no complaints, but Margaret didn't wait for problems to arise. She prevented them. As she stood in her office overlooking the entrance, Margaret made her decision. The man's presence had gone on long enough. She had built her career on protecting the standards of places like Hamilton Heights, and she wasn't about to let anyone threaten that, regardless of their circumstances. She straightened her designer blazer, checked her perfectly styled hair in the reflection of the window, and headed downstairs. It was time to take action, and Margaret Fleming never hesitated once she made up her mind. Margaret stepped out of the building's front entrance, her posture rigid with determination. The morning sun caught the diamond studs in her ears as she approached the corner where Elijah's cart stood. The cart itself bothered her. Though organized with military precision, it represented everything she fought to keep away from Hamilton Heights. Elijah sat nearby on a bench, reading what appeared to be a scientific journal. His weathered hands turned the pages carefully, his focus complete despite the bustling city around him. Margaret noticed how he had positioned himself to be as unobtrusive as possible, but to her, his mere presence felt like an affront to everything the building represented. She cleared her throat loudly, standing over him with her arms crossed. Elijah looked up, his eyes kind but tired. Before he could speak, Margaret launched into her prepared speech. She informed him that his belongings were creating a hazard and that the building had received complaints. It was a lie, but Margaret had long since justified such tactics as necessary for maintaining order. Elijah listened quietly, his calm demeanor only serving to irritate Margaret further. When she finished, he began to explain that he had permission from some residents to keep his cart there temporarily while he waited for his new apartment to be ready. His voice carried an unexpected education and refinement that caught Margaret off guard, but she quickly suppressed her surprise. Other residents began to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Among them was Mrs. Patterson, an elderly resident who often brought Elijah coffee. She stepped forward to intervene, but Margaret raised her hand dismissively. This was her building, her responsibility, and she wouldn't let sentiment cloud her judgment. Margaret's voice grew sharper as she declared that the building's policy was absolute, no unauthorized storage of personal belongings. She gestured to two maintenance workers who had been watching nervously. They hesitated, looking between Elijah and Margaret, but years of conditioning to follow her orders won out. Elijah's composure cracked slightly as he realized what was about to happen. He asked for just a few minutes to collect his most important items: research papers, personal documents, and family mementos. Margaret refused, interpreting his calm request as manipulation. She had seen too many people try to take advantage of kindness, or so she told herself. The maintenance workers began moving Elijah's carefully organized possessions toward the dumpster. Each item revealed glimpses of a life Margaret hadn't bothered to understand. Notebooks filled with complex equations, a carefully preserved military uniform, photographs of what appeared to be scientific conferences. Elijah stood watching, his hands trembling slightly, but his dignity intact. A small crowd had gathered now. Some residents filmed with their phones, others whispered among themselves, but none dared to challenge Margaret directly. Her reputation for retaliation through small inconveniences and denied maintenance requests was well known. Even Mrs. Patterson had retreated, though her face showed clear distress. Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction as the cart was emptied. This was how you maintain standards, through decisive action and unwavering rules. She had built her career on such moments, on being the person willing to make uncomfortable decisions to protect property values and prestigious reputations. What she didn't notice was a figure moving through the crowd, watching the scene unfold with increasing concern. Dressed in simple clothes that allowed him to blend in, Keanu Reeves observed every detail of the interaction. He had come to visit Elijah, his old friend and former professor, only to find this scene of casual cruelty masked as property management. As the last of Elijah's belongings landed in the dumpster, Margaret turned to address the gathered crowd. She began to explain about maintaining community standards and the importance of clear boundaries. But her words trailed off as she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The crowd's attention had moved beyond her, focused on someone else. She turned to find herself face to face with a man whose casual appearance might once have made her dismiss him. A mistake she was about to realize would change everything. The contents of Elijah's cart scattered across the dumpster painted a stark picture of hasty judgment. Each discarded item revealed fragments of an extraordinary life that Margaret had refused to see. Research papers containing complex quantum physics equations fluttered in the wind, their margins filled with handwritten notes that spoke of decades of scientific work. A carefully preserved military uniform bearing distinguished service medals landed atop a stack of family photographs, showing Elijah at prestigious universities, accepting awards, and standing proudly with students. Margaret maintained her professional mask as she watched the maintenance workers complete their task. The morning sun caught the gold name tag on her designer blazer, a symbol of authority she wielded without hesitation. She stood straighter, convinced that her actions served the greater good of maintaining the building's prestigious reputation. Elijah remained motionless near the bench, his weathered hands gripping a small leather notebook, the only possession Margaret hadn't managed to take. His face carried no anger, only a profound sadness that seemed to deepen with each item that disappeared into the dumpster. His composure in the face of such indignity only served to highlight the ugliness of Margaret's actions. The gathered crowd shifted uncomfortably as more of Elijah's life emerged through his discarded belongings. A framed certificate from MIT tumbled against the dumpster's metal wall. Letters bearing official seals from renowned research institutions spilled from a folder. A worn leather case revealed delicate scientific instruments that spoke of precision and expertise. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly resident who had often shown Elijah kindness, pressed forward again. Her voice trembled with emotion as she tried to explain that Elijah wasn't what Margaret assumed. But Margaret cut her off with a sharp gesture, her perfectly manicured nails flashing in the sunlight. She had heard enough excuses, seen enough people try to bend the rules with sob stories and elaborate explanations. The maintenance workers slowed their pace, increasingly uncertain as they handled items that clearly held significant value. One of them carefully set aside a folder marked Quantum Computing Research, classified, before Margaret snapped at him to continue. The worker's hesitation earned him a stern look that promised future consequences. Through it all, the figure in the worn hoodie observed silently. Keanu watched his old friend endure this humiliation with the same dignity he had shown throughout his distinguished career. He saw how Elijah's eyes followed each discarded item, noting the locations where his life's work scattered, planning how he might retrieve the most crucial pieces once the crowd dispersed. Margaret began typing on her tablet, documenting the incident with clinical detachment. She detailed the removal of unauthorized items, careful to phrase everything in terms of policy enforcement. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen, already crafting the email she would send to the board praising her own decisive action in maintaining building standards. The sound of tearing paper cut through the tense atmosphere as a gust of wind caught one of Elijah's notebooks, sending pages of equations spiraling through the air. Elijah made a sudden movement, his first sign of distress, but quickly regained his composure. The gathered residents watched as years of research danced away on the morning breeze, carried off by winds as indifferent as Margaret's judgment. Some of the younger residents had begun searching online, their phones displaying search results that made their eyes widen. Whispers spread through the crowd about quantum physics, breakthrough research, and distinguished military service. But Margaret remained focused on her task, deliberately ignoring the mounting evidence that she had gravely misjudged the situation. The maintenance workers reached the bottom Elijah of the cart, revealing a carefully wrapped package addressed to a prestigious scientific journal. The manila envelope bore overnight delivery labels and multiple warning stamps about confidential content. One worker looked questioningly at Margaret, but she merely pointed to the dumpster, her gesture brooking no argument. As the last items disappeared into the metal container, Margaret turned to address the gathered crowd. Her voice carried the practiced tone of authority she had perfected over years of managing luxury properties. She began explaining about community standards and the importance of clear boundaries, her words falling into the heavy silence with mechanical precision. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. The crowd's attention had moved beyond her, focused on something or someone else. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a collective intake of breath. Margaret turned, her carefully crafted speech faltering as she found herself face to face with a man whose simple appearance belied his true identity. The figure in the worn hoodie stepped forward, and for the first time, Margaret noticed a quiet authority in his bearing. His presence seemed to fill the space differently now, though nothing about his appearance had changed. The morning sun caught his face as he moved, and Margaret felt the first tremor of uncertainty shake her carefully constructed world. The man who had been watching silently throughout the incident was about to speak, and Margaret would soon learn that she had done far more than simply enforce building policy. She had unwittingly created a moment that would strip away her pretenses and force her to confront the true cost of judging others by appearance alone. The figure stepped forward, removing his hood with a deliberate calm that seemed to slow time itself. Keanu Reeves stood between Margaret and the dumpster, his presence transforming the space without a word being spoken. His eyes moved from the scattered papers still drifting in the wind to Elijah's face, then finally settled on Margaret with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step backward. Margaret's professional mask cracked slightly as she processed who stood before her. The same casual clothes she would have dismissed moments ago now seemed to carry a different weight entirely. Her hand moved unconsciously to adjust her blazer, a nervous gesture that betrayed her growing unease. Keanu bent down to retrieve a photograph that had fallen near his feet. The image showed him and Elijah together at a research facility, both younger but unmistakable. He held it carefully, his thumb brushing away a smudge of dirt from the corner. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that commanded attention without requiring volume. He addressed the maintenance workers first, asking them politely to stop what they were doing. They immediately stepped back from the dumpster, relief evident on their faces at having a reason to cease their uncomfortable task. Keanu then turned to Elijah, greeting him with the respect one shows to a cherished mentor. Their brief exchange revealed a history that made Margaret's elegiac twist with growing horror. Elijah, it turned out, wasn't just any scientist. He had been Keanu's physics consultant for several films, helping to ensure the scientific accuracy of complex plots. More than that, he was a renowned quantum physicist whose recent homelessness was temporary, a result of a laboratory accident that had forced the evacuation of his building. The cart Margaret had so eagerly disposed of contained irreplaceable research documents and personal items he had salvaged from his damaged apartment. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Keanu explained Elijah's situation. The professor had been staying nearby while waiting for the completion of repairs to his building, supported by several residents who knew his true identity. His daily presence in the park wasn't loitering. He was continuing his research in the only space available to him, too dedicated to his work to let circumstances interrupt it. Margaret's face had lost its authoritative expression, replaced by a growing pallor as the magnitude of her mistake became clear. Her tablet hung forgotten at her side as Keanu detailed the value of what she had so carelessly thrown away. The classified research papers, the military honors from Elijah's service as a scientific advisor, the personal effects that connected him to a lifetime of academic achievement, all discarded because she had refused to look beyond surface appearances. Keanu moved toward the dumpster, examining its contents with a concern that made Margaret's professional accomplishments suddenly seem hollow. He noted how carefully Elijah had preserved everything, commenting on the organization system that Margaret had interpreted as mere hoarding. Each item he identified carried a story that further illuminated the depth of her misjudgment. The gathered residents, who had watched in silence, now began to move forward. Mrs. Patterson approached Elijah with tears in her eyes, while others offered to help retrieve his belongings. The maintenance workers, without waiting for permission, brought over empty boxes from the building's storage room. The community was mobilizing to right a wrong, leaving Margaret standing alone with her crumbling certainties. Keanu supervised the retrieval effort, ensuring that each recovered item was handled with appropriate care. His movements were deliberate and focused, but occasionally he would glance at Margaret with an expression that carried no anger, only a profound disappointment that felt worse than any reprimand. He was teaching a lesson not through harsh words but through quiet action, demonstrating the respect and dignity that Margaret had failed to show. As the morning wore on, the full scope of Margaret's error became increasingly clear. The crowd had swelled with more residents, many of whom knew Elijah's work or had benefited from his generous sharing of knowledge during his temporary stay near their building. Each new revelation about his contributions to science and society landed, like a physical blow, to Margaret's carefully constructed worldview. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, but Margaret felt cold in her expensive blazer. She watched as Keanu coordinated the careful documentation of any damaged items, his phone occasionally buzzing with calls from colleagues eager to help ensure Elijah's research was preserved. The efficiency and respect with which he managed the situation stood in stark contrast to her own hasty actions, and she knew that this morning would mark a permanent change in how she viewed her role and responsibilities. Morning had shifted to early afternoon, and the atmosphere outside Hamilton Heights had transformed entirely. The crowd that had gathered to watch Margaret's show of authority now witnessed a profound lesson in humility. As residents helped retrieve and organize Elijah's belongings, Keanu shared the full story that Margaret had never bothered to learn. Elijah Morrison wasn't just any scientist. He was Professor Thomas Morrison, a pioneering quantum physicist whose work had revolutionized the field. His temporary homeless status stemmed from a chemical accident in his laboratory that had forced an emergency evacuation of his entire apartment building. Insurance complications and safety protocols had left him in limbo, carrying his most valuable research with him while waiting for clearance to return home. Margaret stood frozen, as Keanu explained how he had met Elijah years ago while preparing for a role that involved complex physics concepts. Their friendship had grown through long discussions about quantum mechanics and the nature of reality. Elijah had become not just a technical consultant, but a trusted friend who helped ground many of Keanu's performances in scientific accuracy. The papers Margaret had so carelessly thrown away included groundbreaking research on quantum computing that various governments had expressed interest in. The military medals came from Elijah's service as a senior scientific advisor to defense research projects. The photographs showed him with Nobel laureates, world leaders, and yes, even celebrities who sought his expertise. Each revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She watched as residents who had previously nodded along with her harsh judgments now rushed to help, offering storage space in their apartments for Elijah's recovered belongings. Mrs. Patterson tearfully explained how Elijah had been tutoring her granddaughter in advanced physics, refusing any payment and asking only for a quiet corner to continue his work. The maintenance workers, now understanding the value of what they had handled, worked with careful precision to retrieve every document and personal item. They treated each recovered piece with reverence, having learned the hard way that value isn't always visible at first glance. Margaret's tablet, still clutched in her hand, now displayed incoming emails from board members who had gotten wind of the situation. The same people who had praised her strict policies hours ago were now demanding explanations. Her carefully crafted professional image was crumbling with each passing minute. Keanu orchestrated the recovery effort with quiet efficiency, his presence a reminder of how true authority needs no flashy displays. He spoke with building security about setting up proper temporary storage for Elijah's remaining belongings, his simple request carrying more weight than Margaret's demands ever had. The most devastating moment came when Elijah finally spoke about his situation. His voice, cultured and precise, carried no bitterness as he explained how some residents had already known his identity but had respected his wish for privacy while he dealt with his temporary displacement. He had chosen this location precisely because it was close to his damaged apartment building, allowing him to coordinate with cleanup crews while continuing his essential research. Margaret's designer blazer felt like armor that no longer protected her. The diamond studs in her ears, meant to signal her authority and success, now seemed like gaudy tokens of misplaced pride. Every detail of her carefully curated professional appearance, stood in stark contrast to the genuine accomplishments of the man she had dismissed as a nuisance. The morning's events had stripped away more than just her professional facade. They had exposed the hollow core of her judgment system. The very standards she had prided herself on upholding now revealed themselves as superficial metrics that had blinded her to true merit and dignity. Keanu's occasional glances in her direction carried no anger, but their quiet disappointment cut deeper than any harsh words could have. He didn't need to lecture or berate. The truth of her actions spoke loudly enough on its own. The lesson was writing itself in the growing pile of recovered items, each one a testament to a life she had failed to recognize and respect. As the last of Elijah's belongings were carefully cataloged and stored, Margaret realized that this revelation would require more than just damage control. Her entire approach to her role, her understanding of what it meant to maintain standards, would need to be reconstructed from the ground up. The prestigious Hamilton Heights had not been diminished by Elijah's presence. It had been diminished by her response to it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the front of Hamilton Heights as Keanu gathered everyone's attention. The recovered items had been carefully stored, but the day's lesson wasn't over. Standing next to Elijah, who still clutched his leather notebook, Keanu addressed the assembled crowd, including a visibly shaken Margaret. His words carried no condemnation but held firm purpose as he spoke about the barriers people create between themselves and others. He talked about his own experiences with being judged by appearance, sharing moments when he had been dismissed or undervalued because he didn't match someone's expectations of success or status. Elijah's story, Keanu explained, represented something far more common than people realized. Circumstances often disguise extraordinary individuals, and snap judgments based on appearance prevented meaningful connections that could enrich entire communities. He spoke about how Elijah had continued his essential research despite his temporary displacement, showing dedication that should have earned respect rather than scorn. Margaret found herself unable to maintain her usual rigid posture as Keanu described the ripple effects of prejudice. Her actions hadn't just affected Elijah, they had influenced how every resident viewed their community. The building's prestigious reputation, which she had thought she was protecting, had actually been damaged by her display of casual cruelty. The recovered items told their own story. The military medals spoke of service and sacrifice. The research papers represented years of work that could benefit humanity. The photographs showed a life dedicated to learning and teaching. Each piece contradicted Margaret's assumptions about their owner, forcing her to confront the superficiality of her value system. Keanu touched on the importance of creating environments that valued character over appearance. He acknowledged that maintaining standards was important, but questioned what those standards should measure. True excellence, he suggested, came from how people treated each other, not from enforcing arbitrary rules about who belonged and who didn't. Several residents stepped forward to share their own experiences with Elijah. A young student described how Elijah had helped her understand complex physics concepts during chance encounters in the park. Another resident admitted feeling ashamed for initially sharing Margaret's prejudices until actually speaking with Elijah and learning about his extraordinary work. The maintenance workers, still organizing the recovered items, added their perspective. They described how differently they might have handled the situation if someone had simply taken the time to understand who Elijah was and what his belongings represented. Their words highlighted how prejudice trickled down through organizations, affecting everyone's behavior. Elijah himself spoke briefly, his dignified manner a sharp rebuke to how he had been treated. He explained that his current situation had given him unique insights into how society often overlooks valuable contributions because they come in unexpected packages. His words carried no bitterness, only hope that his experience might prevent similar judgments in the future. Margaret listened as her carefully constructed professional world shifted on its axis. Every principle she had used to justify her actions now revealed itself as a shield against genuine human connection. The prestigious reputation she had thought she was protecting seemed hollow compared to the authentic community forming before her eyes. Keanu concluded by addressing the broader implications of the day's events. He spoke about how everyday choices to judge or welcome others shaped not just individual lives, but entire communities. The true measure of a prestigious address, he suggested, lay not in keeping people out, but in creating space for human dignity to flourish. The lesson resonated through the gathered crowd, transforming a moment of shame into an opportunity for growth. Residents began discussing ways to prevent similar incidents, suggesting changes to building policies that would preserve standards while respecting human dignity. The conversation shifted from exclusion to inclusion, from judgment to understanding. For Margaret, each word added weight to the growing realization that her entire approach to her role needed reconstruction. The metrics she had used to measure success, keeping undesirable elements away, maintaining a certain appearance, now seemed not just flawed but actively harmful to the community she claimed to serve. As the group began to disperse, the impact of the lesson lingered in the air. The prestigious Hamilton Heights had changed, not through any physical alteration, but through a fundamental shift in how its community understood true value. Margaret stood alone, watching as residents helped organize the last of Elijah's belongings, knowing that Elijah Horo would require her to begin rebuilding more than just her reputation. The sun continued its descent, casting different shadows now, ones that seemed to suggest new possibilities for how the space could be managed. The lesson had been delivered not through harsh punishment, but through gentle revelation, making its impact all the more profound and lasting. The following days at Hamilton Heights marked the beginning of a profound transformation. Margaret returned to work with a different perspective, one shaped by the harsh light of self-awareness. Her office, once a command center for enforcing rigid standards, became a space for reconsidering what truly made a community prestigious. The incident had sparked changes throughout the building. Residents who had previously hurried past each other now stopped to chat, sharing stories and creating connections. The lobby, once merely elegant, gained warmth through small but significant changes. A corner desk appeared where residents could leave messages or requests for help. The maintenance staff, no longer afraid of harsh judgment, worked with renewed enthusiasm. Elijah's situation resolved itself naturally. His apartment building completed its safety protocols, allowing him to return home. But his brief presence had permanently altered Hamilton Heights. He continued to tutor students in the park, now with the building's explicit welcome. The corner where his card had stood became a small reading area, a subtle reminder of the lessons learned about hasty judgments. Margaret's professional transformation proved the most dramatic. She began each day by reviewing not just the building's physical appearance, but the overall atmosphere. Her interactions with residents changed from enforcing rules to building relationships. The same attention to detail that had once fueled her prejudices now helped her notice when members of the community needed support. The board's initial anger over the incident faded as they witnessed the positive changes in the building's culture. Property values remained high, but now the building gained recognition for different reasons. Articles in local papers praised Hamilton Heights for its innovative community programs, many sparked by ideas that emerged during discussions after the incident. Keanu's influence extended beyond that single morning. He occasionally visited Elijah, and each time he praised the visible changes in the building's atmosphere. His simple acknowledgement meant more to Margaret than any professional award she had received. She kept a small photograph on her desk, not of celebrities or accolades, but of the reading corner that replaced the spot where she had once thrown away a man's dignity along with his belongings. The maintenance workers who had helped retrieve Elijah's belongings became advocates for the building's new approach. They shared stories of how treating everyone with respect had made their jobs more rewarding. Their pride shifted from maintaining mere appearances to fostering a genuine sense of community. Mrs. Patterson, who had tried to intervene that fateful morning, became a bridge between long-term residents and newcomers. She often shared the story of that day, not to shame Margaret, but to illustrate how a community could learn and grow from its mistakes. Her granddaughter's physics grades improved dramatically, thanks to continued tutoring sessions with Elijah. Margaret's most significant change came in her understanding of true standards. She realized that maintaining a prestigious address meant creating an environment where dignity and respect flourished naturally. The metrics she now used to measure success focused on how people felt welcomed and valued, not just how impressive the building appeared to outsiders. On the anniversary of that transformative morning, the Hamilton Heights community gathered for a celebration, not of exclusivity or status, but of the connections they had built. Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, watching residents from all walks of life sharing stories and laughter. Her designer blazer hung relaxed on her shoulders, no longer armor but simply clothing. She touched a small notebook she now carried, a gift from Elijah, containing one of his complex equations and a simple message about the mathematics of human dignity. The lessons she had learned that day continued to multiply, creating ripples of change that extended far beyond the building's prestigious address. As the sun set on the gathering, Margaret realized that true transformation wasn't about changing policies or procedures. It was about changing hearts and perspectives, about learning to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, and about understanding that real prestige came not from keeping people out, but from welcoming them in.